water. In 1834, the convicts started building ships. The convicts constructed 15 large ships and 140 smaller boats. Only the well-behaved convicts were given the privilege of building the boats. The worst of the worst convicts were sent to what was referred to as the separate prison. This special building was constructed after the main penitentiary was built and was meant to be used as a type of solitary confinement. When convicts were sent to the separate prison, they were ordered to wear a hood in complete darkness, as they were not able to speak to anyone. Many of the convicts that were sent to the separate prison developed mental illnesses due to the solitary confinement treatment. Since the settlement was constructed right on the Tasman Peninsula, they had also various docking stations around the peninsula for boats to pull up to. In addition to building ships and boats, the settlement also offered regular boat maintenance and upkeep to anyone who needed it. Those dockyards still stand today. In 1842, a flour mill and granary were built to offer additional jobs to the convicts. In 1848, the settlement stopped making ships altogether. The number of convicts that were sent to Port Arthur started dwindling slowly. At first, but then more and more convicts were being taken away from the settlement. In 1877, the last convict was shipped out. That same year, the Port Arthur area was given to private interests, and they began logging almost immediately. The settlement was no longer known as Port Arthur, but was now referred to as Carnarvon. Several years later, there were 2 severe fires that ripped through Carnarvon. One fire was in 1895, and the second was just 2 years later in 1897. Many of the original buildings that sat on the settlement were ruined from these fires, while others such as the penitentiary, the separate prison, and the convict hospital were completely gutted. The residents of Carnarvon did what they could to make Carnarvon a community. They added a post office and even a cricket club. By the 1920s and 1930s, Carnarvon had 3 hotels and 2 museums. Almost all of the occupations that made up the community were tourist-related. In 1927, the residents reinstated the Port Arthur name. The settlement received funding in 1979 to restore and preserve the site as a tourist attraction. In 2016, Port Arthur had a population of just 251. In addition to the shops and cafes, the convict settlement is also referred to as an open-air museum. An open-air museum is a collection of buildings that are displayed outside in the open. Many travelers from all over the world go to Port Arthur to see the ancient settlement, which made it the perfect opportunity for Mark to open fire.
In a small, narrow, upright cubicle in the chapel of the separate prison at Tasmania's convict settlement of Port Arthur. In the early 1800s, the difficult prisoners were placed in the separate prison. The intention was to break their spirit, not by the usual method of beating, but by keeping them entirely separate from one another. In fact, even in the chapel, they could look at the preacher who stood there, they could sing the hymns, but they weren't allowed to look at each other nor to speak to each other. That was the rule for the entire separate prison. Getting to the exercise yard provided a problem. A prisoner might actually see another prisoner. So they had a rule which said whenever 2 prisoners approached, one had to stop and face the wall while the other one walked past. Also, to make absolutely sure that prisoners couldn't recognise each other, they were required to wear special uniforms with hoods over their faces. To keep the noise level right down in the prison, the corridors were covered with a rough type of carpet, and the guards wore soft slippers.
We will be right back after these short messages. Mark was born on May 7, 1967, at the Queen Alexandria Hospital, and was raised in Hobart, Tasmania, in Australia. He was raised in a relatively normal household with a mom, dad, and sister, and as a baby he was happy and content. Mark's mother did notice that Mark would reject all forms of physical affection while growing up, and would push away any hugs or snuggles. The issues didn't get better as he got older, in fact, they only got worse. He was very hard to handle even as a toddler. Mark was always wandering off, so much so that his mom would leave him on the house veranda tied up with a harness and leash, surrounded by his toys to keep him busy and contained. As a toddler, he even swallowed a nail. Mark's mom also noticed that his speech development was rather slow. As soon as Mark started school, his parents noticed he began having even more issues. He was disruptive and sometimes even violent. Even as young as elementary school, Mark was aggressive, destructive, and tormented other children. Mark's teachers reported to his parents that Mark always seemed very distant and unemotional. At 10 years old, he was hospitalized because of burns he received from playing with fireworks.
I broke the stick trying to get out, but I couldn't, and It's made a hole through my jeans.
You think you'll be playing with firecrackers anymore?
Yes.
Don't you think you've learned a lesson from this?
Yes, but I'm still playing with it.
According to his mother, Mark had a tendency to aggravate people, so he was always in trouble. Just like a lot of other shooters we have covered in this podcast, Mark also had a history of being bullied in school. In 1980, Mark was moved to the special education unit at Newtown High School. When Mark had turned 14, his father gave him an air rifle. Mark immediately started using the air rifle irresponsibly. He would shoot small animals and hide behind bushes, firing the rifle at cars as they drove by. One time he shot a parrot out of a tree with the air rifle. When the helpless bird fell from the tree, he continued to shoot it in the head until the parrot was dead. On May 6, 1983, the day before Mark's 16th birthday, he left school and never returned. He was deemed unemployable because he would constantly upset and annoy people, making it impossible for him to hold a job.
Not until the psychiatrist told us. They said he would never ever be able to hold a position down. Simply because he would aggravate people to such an extent that he'd always be in trouble.
Mark received a disability pension, but would also pick up odd jobs as a handyman and as a gardener. In 1987, Mark met a 54-year-old woman who was very, very wealthy. Mark was only 19 years old when he befriended the woman and moved in with her into her mansion. While together, they spent a lot of money. They would go shopping almost every day and eat out at expensive restaurants. The woman's elderly mother also lived with them in the mansion. They were a rather odd trio. There were about 40 cats living in the garage and 14 dogs living inside the house. In 1990, someone made a complaint to the health department, complaining about the dilapidating condition of the mansion. Not only were the animals using the home as their own bathroom, but there were also dirty dishes and trash everywhere. The elderly mother had an untreated broken hip as well as infective leg ulcers. She was taken to the hospital and later a nursing home where she eventually passed away. The woman also had health issues and had to spend a short amount of time in the hospital. Cleanup order was placed on the home, requiring that it be cleaned before it was deemed habitable again. Mark and his father took it upon themselves to clean the mansion from top to bottom. In 1991, Mark and his lady friend moved to a 72-acre farm once again started collecting animals. On October 20th, 1992, the woman was driving her vehicle with Mark in the passenger seat when, without warning, Mark leaned over and jerked the steering wheel out of the woman's hands. This was something he had done before, and whether it was a form of aggression or just joking around, no one really knew. This caused the woman to steer into oncoming traffic and cause a head-on collision. The woman died in the traffic accident, while Mark was severely injured. He suffered from back and neck injuries, causing him to spend about 7 months in the hospital. The wealthy woman left everything she owned to Mark, including the 72-acre farm and the mansion. He received over $550,000 in assets. Because he quickly inherited a large amount of money and his lack of maturity, Mark's mother took guardianship over him and his funds. Mark's father became the caretaker at the farm, while Mark lived at the family's home as he was still recovering. In August of 1993, Mark's father went missing. He was found on August 16, 1993, in a dam near the farmhouse with a weight belt around his neck. His death was ruled a suicide.
His father committed suicide, from what we understand, from the sheer burden of trying to keep this kid, who he loved but he knew could become dangerous, on a leash.
Because of Mark's father's death, Mark received approximately another $250,000. After the death of his father, Mark decided to sell the farmhouse and move back into the mansion. He was able to sell the farm for about $143,000. Not long after the death of his wealthy friend, whom Mark claimed to never have a sexual relationship with, and the death of his father, Mark's mental status continued to deteriorate. His drinking increased, and in 1995, he became suicidal. Mark would also dress oddly. He would wear a gray linen suit, lizard skin shoes, Panama hat, and would carry a briefcase. He also had an electric blue suit with flared trousers and a ruffled shirt. He would normally wear this outfit out to restaurants where others would continuously make fun of him. Although he didn't seem to care about this, his suicidal thoughts and drinking increased greatly. Mark would drink about a half bottle of Sambuca and a full bottle of Bailey's Irish Cream almost daily. In addition to the Sambuca and Bailey's, he also enjoyed drinking wine and other alcoholic drinks that were on the sweeter side. Shortly after the massacre, in an interview with police, Mark said that he had thought about the massacre anywhere from 4 to 12 weeks prior to the actual shooting. Mark was born with a personality disorder. He was intellectually impaired, and he was possibly on the autism spectrum. A court-appointed psychiatrist would later state that Mark was socially and intellectually impaired, but had no signs of schizophrenia or a mood disorder. One of the psychiatrists said that Mark was clearly a very disturbed person, but he was not mentally ill and was competent to stand trial. Mark had a limited vocabulary and couldn't read or write. When he spoke, he often misused and mispronounced words. Months before the shooting, Mark started taking antidepressant medications, but he reported to others that they weren't working and he was still feeling depressed with suicidal thoughts. It was determined that Mark was mentally impaired as a result of the low-level intelligence, and he had an IQ of only 66. For perspective, the average IQ in the United States is 98. As previously mentioned, Mark was charged with his first count of murder on April 30th, 1996, from his hospital bed via court video system. His trial was set for November 7th, 1996. Initially, Mark pled not guilty to all charges, but would later change his plea to guilty. Mark later stated that he was pressured into giving a guilty plea by his defense attorney, Mark Avery. He pled guilty to 72 charges, some of which included murder, attempted murder, causing grievous bodily harm, and arson. On November 22, 1996, just 2 weeks after giving his guilty plea, Mark was sentenced to 35 life sentences, plus an additional 1,035 years, without the possibility of parole. In other words, he will never be released from prison. In the first 8 months of his prison sentence, he was confined to a specially built suicide cell, which was a lot like solitary confinement. For 10 years, Mark stayed in protective custody until he was moved to a newly built prison nearby. On November 13, 2006, more than 10 years after the massacre, Mark was sent to Hobart's Wilfrid Lopes Center. The Hobart's Wilfrid Lopes Center was a secure mental health facility that was specifically built for inmates. The center had 35 beds for inmates with mental health issues of all kinds. The inmates that were staying at the center were monitored and treated like inmates, but they weren't locked down like most prisons and could move freely throughout the center. On March 25, 2007, Mark attempted suicide for the first time by cutting his wrists with a razor blade that he had taken apart. On March 27, 2007, just 2 days later, Mark attempted suicide yet again with a razor blade that he had taken apart. As of 2015, Mark was housed in the maximum security unit at Risdon Prison, and he claims to have no memory of the killings. The Port Arthur Massacre brought forth many issues with gun laws that Australia had that were hidden in plain sight. Because of the massacre, gun laws had to be modified drastically, and the government knew they needed to do something. The government put a nationwide ban on all semi-automatic and automatic firearms. To encourage citizens to give up their firearms, the federal government paid for a buyback where the government would buy back all semi-automatic and automatic firearms from its citizens. Over 750,000 guns were bought back by the government. Mark's mother still visits him when she is allowed to. Sometimes Mark refuses to see her when she visits, but he never really gave any sort of reason why. His mom complained that he wasn't being taken very well care of while in prison, because he had become overweight due to his medications he was taking, lack of exercise while in prison, and poor nutrition.
Through the medication, which puts weight on, and also lack of exercise.
There were different conspiracies that were erected by people in the community. Some citizens say that it was a government conspiracy and that the massacre was created as an excuse to ban guns. There were also people that argued Mark was never given a fair trial. No fingerprints were taken, and there was no ballistic evidence, while some people believe that it wasn't him at all.
When he was questioned, probably for weeks before I saw him again, he always said he was never in Port Arthur at Broad Arrow. A lot of people on that day came forward after, and they said, as far as they were concerned, they didn't recognise the gunman.
There will always be different theories for each and every shooting that happens in the world. It is up to each and every one of us to take a stand and speak up when we see something. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Active Shooter, the podcast. Make sure to check us out on social media. We have a newly formed discussion group on Facebook. Just search for Active Shooter, the podcast discussion group. You can also find us on Instagram at Active the Podcast and Twitter at Podcast Active. For just $1 a month, you can get access to ad-free episodes, early release episodes when available, and a shout out on the show. Just go to www.patreon.com